It's hard to imagine that a story could begin with laughter and end with silence, so absolute that it changes everyone who hears it. But that's what happened in a small Pennsylvania town on a cold October night. A young mother kissed her baby goodbye, trusting the father to keep her safe, unaware that she was handing her daughter into the hands of someone who would let her slip away. The baby's name was Zara Lynn Scrugs, and from the moment she came into the world, she carried light, those wide, curious eyes, the soft giggles that melted even the toughest hearts. Her family called her Moo, a silly nickname that somehow captured her joy, her chubby cheeks, and her love for music. To them, she wasn't just a baby. She was a reason to wake up smiling. Her parents, Erica Scruggs and Kamal Stevens, had once been a happy couple. They met through mutual friends, fell in love, and like so many young pairs, believed that their story would be different. But life rarely unfolds the way we dream it will. By the time Zara was born, their relationship had already cracked under the weight of frustration, distance, and pride. Still, they promised to stay united for their daughter's sake, to share her first words, her first steps, her first everything. For nearly a year, that uneasy truce seemed to hold. Austin visited often. He played the role of the proud dad, showing her off to neighbors, smiling for photos. People saw him as reliable, an assistant football coach, a construction business owner, a young man doing well for himself. No one could have guessed that behind that calm exterior was someone who would one day Google, "How do you know if a baby is dead?" instead of calling for help. But evil doesn't always announce itself with shouting or scars. Sometimes it hides behind a steady voice and a practiced smile. In truth, Austin wasn't the picture of a struggling single father. He was a man unraveling, his ego more fragile than anyone realized. His apartment was newly rented, cold, without heat or electricity, bare walls, and darker thoughts. Yet on October 3rd, 2020, he picked up his daughter for the weekend, convincing everyone, including Erica, that it was fine. She handed Zara over with a smile, kissed her little head, and waved goodbye. That small wave would be the last act of peace before the storm. October 3rd, 2020, a Saturday like any other. Autumn was settling in, the air crisp with that mix of comfort and melancholy that comes before winter. For Erica, handing Zara over to her father didn't feel unusual. They'd done it before. There had never been a reason not to trust him. Austin seemed like he loved his daughter. He always spoke about her proudly, posted pictures of her smiling face, told his friends she was his whole world. But what people say and what they live are often two different things. That day, as he drove away with Zara, his mind was far from fatherhood. He had just moved into a small apartment off Germantown Pike in Lower Providence, a place that barely qualified as livable. The power hadn't been turned on, there was no heat, and the temperature hovered around 59 degrees inside. To any responsible parent, that alone would have been enough to postpone a visit. But Austin didn't think like that. Maybe it was arrogance. Maybe he was just too detached to care. Either way, he brought a baby into a dark, cold apartment that night, and the consequences would be irreversible. Witnesses later described Austin as distant, oddly composed when he spoke about Zara that weekend. He texted a few friends casually, sent messages to women on social media, even flirted like a man whose life had no urgency, no conscience. What's haunting about that isn't just his lack of focus, it's the quiet normalcy of it. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't overwhelmed. He was living his life as if nothing about this weekend would change him forever. That evening, neighbors heard muffled sounds through the thin apartment walls. No one thought much of it, a young dad, a restless baby, maybe just bedtime struggles. But what happened behind that door wasn't ordinary parenting frustration. Somewhere between the hum of a small refrigerator and the creak of old floorboards, something went terribly wrong. Zara was just 10 months old, barely learning to walk. her vocabulary still soft babbles. She loved Sesame Street, her Elmo doll, and dancing to music. And in that apartment, those small joys collided with an environment that had no warmth, no comfort, and no safety. What led to her final moments may never be fully understood. But what we know is this. Sometime after 9 p.m., the messages on Austin's phone shifted from playful conversation to panic. He opened Google and typed, "How to tell if a baby is dead." Minutes later, "How long does it take for a baby to stop breathing?" He searched those things while his daughter lay dying only a few feet away. Instead of calling for help, he read about what happens after it's too late. It's the kind of detail that makes even veteran detectives shudder, because it tells you he knew and he waited. At 10:40 p.m., a 911 dispatcher in Montgomery County received a call that would later haunt everyone who heard it. The man on the line, Austin Stevens, sounded oddly calm. He said his 10-month-old daughter wasn't breathing, that he needed help. His voice didn't carry the panic you'd expect from a father. No trembling, no desperation, no breaking under the weight of fear. It was controlled, mechanical, detached. Paramedics were dispatched immediately, rushing through the narrow suburban streets toward the new apartment he had rented just days earlier. When they arrived, what they found didn't feel like an accident scene. It felt like a place that had already gone cold. Zara was lying on the bed in nothing but a diaper. Her skin was pale, her tiny lips discolored, her body cold to the touch. The room itself was freezing, no heat, no electricity, the air thick and still. One of the responders asked Austin to grab medical equipment from their bag while they began CPR, but he handed them the wrong item. When corrected, he just shrugged. His face stayed blank, his movements slow, as though this wasn't his daughter fighting for her life, but a stranger's child in some clinical scenario. Paramedics worked frantically, trying to bring her back. They performed compressions, checked her airway, and administered oxygen. But nothing worked. At 12 a.m. on October 4th, 2020, Zara Lynn Scrugs was pronounced dead. For the medics, that moment was unbearable. They had seen tragedy before, but there was something different about this one, something hollow in the way her father stood there, arms folded, eyes unfocused. When they told him his daughter didn't make it, he sighed, just sighed, as if they had told him the weather forecast, not that his only child was gone. That reaction alone triggered suspicion. The lead paramedic quietly radioed police to remain on scene. They'd been trained to recognize the emotional dissonance between shock and guilt, and Austin wasn't in shock. He was in control. When detectives questioned him later that night, his story came out rehearsed. He said Zara had slipped in the bath while he went to the kitchen to grab a drink. He heard a thud, rushed back, and found her unresponsive. He claimed he wrapped her in a towel, tried CPR, then laid her on the bed. It sounded plausible enough until investigators looked closer. There was no bathwater residue, no sign she'd been submerged, no damp floor, no towel wet enough to suggest a recent bath. And the temperature of her body indicated she hadn't just stopped breathing minutes ago. It had been much longer. Then came the discovery that changed everything. When police obtained his phone, they saw what he'd been doing during that missing hour between Zara's collapse and his call for help. The search history told the story he wouldn't. How to tell if a baby is dead. How long before a baby stops breathing? Infant CPR. But the most damning detail wasn't just what he searched, it was what else he did. Mixed between those searches were flirtatious messages to two women on social media. While his daughter lay dying, Austin was sending selfies and small talk. He wasn't panicking. He was multitasking. That coldness, those two overlapping realities, cemented the investigators' belief that this was no accident. A father who could type those words into a search bar but not dial 911 until an hour later wasn't trying to save his child. He was deciding what to do about her death. The next morning, the Montgomery County Coroner's Office began the slow, grim process of finding out what really happened to baby Zara. In forensic work, the body speaks louder than words ever can, and what Zara's small frame revealed made even seasoned investigators stop and take a breath. Her injuries didn't match a bathtub fall. There were no water traces in her lungs, no bruising consistent with slipping on a hard surface. Instead, what the medical examiner found told a story of violence. Blunt force trauma to the head, deliberate, forceful, lethal. The autopsy also uncovered older bruises and faint healing marks on her torso and arms, the kind that suggest repeated harm over time, not a single tragic moment. Those findings tore apart Austin's version of events. There was no spilled water, no damp floor, no towel soaked from panic. And yet, he had described a dramatic rescue attempt, one that left behind no trace of urgency. Investigators now had proof of what they'd suspected all along. Zara hadn't died because her father was careless. She died because he'd hurt her. What haunted detectives most wasn't just the act of violence, but the hours that followed. In interviews, first responders spoke about Austin's detachment, his almost clinical demeanor. They'd seen grief in many forms: anger, screaming, collapse, but never a father so still. One investigator later described it this way: he didn't look broken. He looked relieved. When police executed a search warrant on his apartment, they documented every detail. The room was nearly bare, no decorations, no signs of warmth, a makeshift crib, a few empty bottles, and the phone that had become the key piece of evidence. Forensic technicians examined it line by line. The timestamps painted a horrifying timeline. 9:27 p.m. her first search. Infant not breathing. 9:34. How long does it take for a baby to die? 9:45 messages to women. 10:22 final search before calling 911. The gap between the first and last action. Nearly an hour was the window where a single phone call could have saved her. Instead, he spent it Googling the difference between life and death. It's a detail that shocks the mind, but also forces a darker question. Why? Why would a man who had every resource, every chance to call for help, choose not to? Psychologists later noted that cases like this often reflect narcissism, people who see their children not as beings to love, but as extensions of their control. When things go wrong, they don't feel empathy. They feel inconvenience. For Austin, that night might have been about ego, anger, or frustration. But for Zara, it was final. Once the autopsy report was completed, prosecutors upgraded his charges from neglect to homicide. The official cause of death: blunt force trauma consistent with intentional head injury. A phrase clinical on paper, but unbearable in meaning. The headlines hit local news within hours, shocking a community that once seen him as a beloved youth football coach. How could a man who coached children, who smiled in team photos, who neighbors described as polite, be the same person responsible for this? But that's the part that always chills people the most. Evil doesn't always look like evil. Sometimes it looks like the guy next door, carrying a duffel bag and smiling at practice, while the truth hides beneath the surface. When news of Zara's death reached the community, disbelief rippled through the quiet neighborhoods of Lower Providence. Parents from the Youth Football League, the very team where Austin Stevens coached, struggled to process it. This was the same man who had taught their sons discipline, teamwork, and drive. He wasn't a stranger lurking in the shadows. He was the coach they shook hands with after every game. To them, Austin had always seemed collected, professional, maybe a little cold, but never cruel. That's what made the truth so unbearable. Behind the social mask of the local football coach was a man leading a double life. Investigators began peeling back the layers, uncovering a personality driven not by fatherly love, but by control, resentment, and self-absorption. His online presence painted the picture: an aspiring entrepreneur, co-owner of Black Diamond Construction. Posting motivational quotes about success, loyalty, and being a real man. But in private, his phone told a different story. The digital forensics team found messages that read like a psychological profile in real-time flirtations, casual jokes, even sexual messages exchanged with multiple women, all while his infant daughter lay critically injured just feet away. There were no messages of panic, no calls for help, just fragments of indifference. The time-stamped messages proved that Austin wasn't overwhelmed. He was detached, methodical, and disturbingly calm. That combination, experts later explained, reflected a complete absence of empathy. It's the type of emotional void often seen in individuals who lack the capacity to see their children as independent beings with feelings and fragility. To them, a child becomes a symbol of their success or failure, a reflection, not a person. As detectives pieced together the evidence, they reconstructed a chilling timeline of that night. Zara's injury occurred sometime between 9 o'clock and 9:15 p.m. Within minutes, instead of calling for help, Austin picked up his phone, not to save her, but to save himself. He began searching questions that blended denial with curiosity. What does a baby look like when they stop breathing? And can brain damage happen right away? The detail that stood out most wasn't just what he searched, but the order he searched it in. It was like watching guilt grow in real time, first confusion, then calculation. Investigators theorized that he had struck Zara in anger, perhaps during bath time, and when she lost consciousness. His first instinct wasn't to get her medical attention, but to figure out how to cover his tracks. When police confronted him with the evidence, Austin didn't break down. He didn't cry. He simply said, "I didn't mean for it to happen." But the science told different stories. Zara's head injury was caused by a level of force no accident could explain. It was deliberate, intentional, final. The community that once saw Austin as a role model now saw him as a monster wearing a familiar face. Parents who had once trusted him to coach their children were now holding those children tighter, struggling to explain how someone capable of such calm could commit something so vile. But that's the thing about evil. It doesn't always come with warning signs. Sometimes it smiles at you across the bleachers and promises to be a good dad. And sometimes it takes a child's life while pretending to learn CPR from Google. The morning after the autopsy confirmed what no parent should ever have to hear, that Zara's death was the result of deliberate head trauma. Detectives moved swiftly. The arrest warrant for Austin Stevens was signed, and officers arrived at his apartment before sunrise. As they approached, there was no chase, no dramatic struggle. Austin opened the door wearing a sweatshirt, his expression blank, his voice quiet. "I figured you'd be coming," he said. That calm acceptance made officers uneasy. It wasn't resignation. It was detachment. Inside, his living space still carried the cold echo of the night before. Unwashed bottles, a folded towel, a child's toy left on the floor. The air hung heavy with a faint mustiness that seemed to hold the memory of what had happened. Officers handcuffed him, read him his rights, and led him down the narrow stairwell as neighbors peeked from their windows, their faces pale with disbelief. News traveled fast. Local youth football coach arrested in death of 10-month-old daughter. It was the kind of headline that froze a community. People who had once waved to him now crossed the street when they saw his name. Parents from his teen group chat wrote messages of horror. He seemed so normal. He played with our kids. But the mask of normalcy was already gone. At the police station, detectives replayed the 911 call and compared it with his demeanor during interrogation. The contrast was chilling. In the call, he'd been oddly calm. In the interrogation room, he was still emotionless, explaining the events as if narrating someone else's story. "I was bathing her," he said. "She slipped. I tried to help. When asked why he waited nearly an hour to call for help, he said, "I was looking things up. I didn't know what to do." The lead detective leaned forward and asked, "You knew how to Google how to tell if a baby is dead, but not how to dial 911. Austin's silence in that moment said more than any words could. Investigators presented him with the phone logs, the messages, the timeline. He didn't deny them. He didn't defend himself. He simply said, "I didn't mean for it to happen." But forensic experts had already confirmed the opposite. The type of impact Zara suffered wasn't the result of a slip. It was the kind of trauma caused by blunt force, an intentional blow. They found patterns consistent with being struck, not falling. There were bruises, 2 older ones, evidence that this wasn't a one-time tragedy, but the end of a pattern. The district attorney's office upgraded the charges to first-degree murder, aggravated assault, and endangering the welfare of a child. For the community, it was both justice and heartbreak. Erica, Zara's mother, received the news surrounded by family. There are no words to capture that kind of pain, the shock of realizing that someone you once loved, someone you trusted with your child, was the reason you'll never hear her laugh again. Her family later described that moment as the daytime stopped. Reporters who gathered outside her parents' home described candles and photos of Zara smiling in her pink headband, her eyes bright and full of innocence. Strangers from all over sent letters, flowers, and condolences. People who didn't know her grieved as if they did. And maybe that's because tragedies like this don't stay confined to one family, they ripple outward, touching every parent who's ever trusted. Every person who's ever believed they could tell the difference between good and evil. The trial of Kamal Stevens began in March 2022, nearly a year and a half after Zara's death. By then, the case had already consumed the community. Parents, teachers, even strangers still spoke her name with a mix of anger and disbelief. Inside the courthouse, every seat was filled. Not just by journalists, but by people who needed to understand how someone could do this to their own child. On one side sat Austin, dressed neatly in a gray suit, his posture rigid, his expression as unreadable as ever. On the other side sat Erica and her family, Zara's grandparents, clutching tissues, her mother holding a locket that contained a photo of her daughter. From the first gavel strike, the courtroom carried a silence so heavy it felt like air itself had weight. The prosecution didn't waste time. They painted a picture of neglect, cruelty, and shocking indifference. They played the 911 call, highlighting the absence of panic. They displayed charts showing Austin's internet searches and timestamps. They brought in forensic experts who testified about the injuries. Blunt force trauma so severe it fractured her skull. Older bruises suggesting repeated harm, and a cause of death that could never be mistaken for an accident. The medical examiner's words were clinical but devastating. This was not consistent with a fall. The injuries required significant force. When photographs of Zara were shown her tiny body, the bruises no parent should ever see, the jury collectively winced. One juror wiped away tears. Another couldn't look at the screen. Even hardened detectives in the back of the courtroom bowed their heads. The prosecution emphasized that during the most critical moments of his daughter's life, Austin wasn't panicking, he was Googling. They read aloud the exact search terms, each one landing like a hammer. How do you know if a baby is dead? How long can a baby go without breathing? How to do CPR on an infant. Then they revealed what else he was doing in between those searches, sending flirtatious messages to 2 women. While his baby lay dying, the prosecutor said, voice rising, he was chatting with other women. That's who this man is. The defense tried to counter, claiming it was panic, not malice, that he was overwhelmed, inexperienced, and made poor choices. They argued that the Google searches were an attempt to save his daughter, not an effort to delay help. But the jury had already seen the timeline, the 55-minute gap between injury and the call for help. The evidence spoke louder than any excuse. As expert witnesses walked the jury through the biomechanics of head injuries, one thing became clear. Zara's death wasn't a tragic accident. It was an act of violence. When the prosecution rested, Erica took the stand. Her voice trembled as she described her daughter's last moments of joy. The way she laughed at her Elmo doll, the little curls that stuck to her forehead after bath time. "I trusted him," she said quietly, her voice breaking. "He told me she was safe." In that moment, the courtroom wasn't just a place of justice. It was a confessional for every parent who's ever misplaced trust. When the jury was dismissed to deliberate, the courtroom exhaled for the first time in days. It had been an emotional marathon, hours of testimony, evidence, photographs that no one could unsee. Outside, reporters waited with cameras ready, but inside, time seemed suspended. Some juries take days to decide a murder case. This one took 90 minutes. That was all it took for 12 strangers to see through every excuse, every claim of panic, every carefully rehearsed statement. When they filed back into the room, their faces said everything before the foreperson even spoke. Guilty on all counts: murder, aggravated assault, endangering the welfare of a child. The words hit like thunder. Erica closed her eyes and wept quietly, her hands shaking as her mother held her. Austin Stevens didn't move. He stared straight ahead, expressionless, like the verdict was a detail he'd already accepted. Some said it looked like defiance. Others said it was emptiness. But whatever it wasn't remorse. The judge, her tone steady but cold, asked if he had anything to say before sentencing. He didn't, not a word. No apology. No explanation. Just silence. The same silence that had filled that apartment on the night Zara died. The judge didn't hold back. She spoke about the sacred responsibility of parenthood, about how helpless a 10-month-old baby is, about how it takes a certain kind of darkness to look into a child's eyes and still choose harm. "You were her protector," she said, her voice firm. "Instead, you became her executioner." When she handed down the maximum sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole, there was a collective sigh of relief. The courtroom didn't cheer. It just sat there in heavy, grieving silence. Justice had been served, but no one felt victorious. The lead prosecutor, a veteran of dozens of homicide trials, later told reporters, "I've handled terrible cases, but this one stays with you. Because it's not just what he did, it's what he didn't do." The indifference. Even Austin's parents couldn't defend him. His mother released a statement saying she was heartbroken beyond words, and that she and his father could not stand by him after what he had done. For the first time, even his own family drew a line. As he was led out of the courtroom, shackled and flanked by deputies, Austin didn't look back. But the camera flashes did, capturing the image of a man whose choices had destroyed every trace of the life he once knew. Outside, the air was sharp and cold. Erica stepped out with her family, clutching the same locket she'd worn every day of the trial. Inside it, a photo of Zara smiling with that unmistakable sparkle in her eyes, the way she looked before the world failed her. "It doesn't bring her back," her mother said softly to the cameras, "but at least she has peace now." In the days following the verdict, silence swept through the small Pennsylvania community that once knew Austin Stevens as a neighbor, a coach, and a friend. But silence can be deceptive. It wasn't the stillness of peace, but the kind that lingers after something sacred has been broken. For weeks, the local park where Zara used to play became an unspoken memorial. Families left flowers, pink balloons, and stuffed Elmo dolls at the swing she loved most. Strangers who had never met her came just to stand quietly, to whisper prayers into the autumn wind. Her name, Zara Lynn Scrugs, had become a symbol of what happens when trust is misplaced and systems fail to see the signs. Erica, her mother, was living in a space between heartbreak and survival. In interviews, she never once spoke her ex's name. She spoke only of Zara, the way she'd hum before falling asleep, how her laughter could fill a room, how her eyes would follow the light through the curtains. She was everything good in the world, she said, her voice soft but unwavering. Erica began to channel her grief into something larger than herself. She connected with advocacy groups focused on child safety and domestic awareness, using her platform to speak not as a victim, but as a warning. "You never think it can happen to you," she said during one event, standing before a crowd holding candles. "But sometimes the people you trust most are the ones you should fear." Those words stayed with people. They made parents reevaluate, made neighbors pay closer attention. Because that was the cruel truth of Zara's story. Everyone thought she was safe. She had loving grandparents, a devoted mother, a father who seemed responsible. On paper, she should have been protected. But tragedy doesn't care about appearances. It thrives in the spaces where people look the other way. In the months after the trial, community leaders began pushing for new safety initiatives, better oversight for informal custody arrangements, more rigorous welfare checks when one parent reports unstable living conditions. Local police officers started hosting seminars to teach residents how to recognize the subtle signs of child neglect, those faint, easily dismissed details that so often precede the headlines. Because every time a case like Zara's hits the news, people say the same thing. How could no one have stopped it? The answer is complicated. Sometimes it's fear of overstepping. Sometimes it's trust in appearances. But most often, it's silence. The same silence that echoed in Austin's apartment that night now echoed through the town, a silence people were finally determined to break. Erica's parents, who had once believed their daughter and granddaughter were safe, found solace in creating something lasting. They set up the Zara Lynn Foundation, a small nonprofit dedicated to providing emergency resources for single mothers in distress. "We can't bring her back," Zara's grandfather said at the launch event, "but we can make sure fewer families live through what we did." And that, in its own quiet way, became Zara's legacy, not the horror of her final moments, but the awareness her story left behind. She became a reminder written into the heart of a community that finally learned that love alone isn't enough. Protection requires action, attention, and courage to see what's uncomfortable. Every tragedy leaves behind two stories, the one that happened and the one we choose to tell about it. Zara's story isn't just about what her father did. It's about every person who saw the signs too late. Every system that failed to ask harder questions, every time someone said, "It's not my place." Because that's where most heartbreak begins, not in violence, but in silence. In the months that followed the trial, Zara's name appeared less in headlines and more in conversations, whispered in parenting groups, mentioned in classrooms, invoked during community meetings about child welfare. People spoke her name with a kind of reverence, as if saying it out loud was both a tribute and a warning. For her mother, Erica, every day was a negotiation with grief. There's no recovery from losing a child. There's only survival. But she found a purpose in making sure her daughter's short life meant something. Through the Zara Lynn Foundation, she began organizing workshops for young parents, teaching them not just about childcare, but about recognizing emotional instability, domestic danger, and mental health red flags. Her voice, once trembling, grew steadier each time she spoke. "We can't undo the past," she would say, "but we can stop history from repeating." Those words resonated deeply, because Zara's story wasn't unique. It was a reflection of countless cases where love and danger coexist in the same home, where a child's laughter is silenced not by strangers, but by those meant to protect them. And while the details differ, the message remains universal. Protection begins with awareness. It's the teacher who notices a bruise that doesn't match the story, The neighbor who hears crying through thin walls. The friend who sees exhaustion in a mother's eyes and chooses to ask, "Are you okay?" Those moments, small human moments, are where prevention begins. Zara's case reminds us that the measure of a society isn't how it mourns after tragedy, but how it listens before it happens. When detectives said they'd never seen such brutality, what they really meant was that they'd never seen such indifference. A man who could Google how to tell if a baby is dead, instead of calling 911, didn't just commit a crime. He revealed what apathy looks like when taken to its most horrific extreme. And if there's one thing to take from this story, it's that compassion has to be louder than convenience. Because children can't speak for themselves. They rely on the rest of us to notice, to act, to care. Zara Lynn Scrugs only lived 10 months, but in that time she made people smile. She made them laugh. She made them believe in innocence. Her life mattered, not because of how it ended, but because of how much it teaches us about what love should look like when it's real. So, if you ever find yourself hesitating to intervene, remember her name. Remember the swing in the park, the pink balloons, the candles in the cold. And remember that protecting a child is not interference. It's humanity. Zara's story is more than heartbreak. It's a lesson about vigilance, empathy, and courage. Evil often hides behind ordinary faces, and safety can never be assumed. Every bruise ignored, every cry dismissed, every doubt unspoken can become the silence that costs a life. We owe it to children like Zara to replace that silence with action, to look closer, to care louder, and to believe that intervention is love in its most urgent form.